this current Labour government, which is easily the most authoritarian government since the Second World War and probably before that, which seems to have so little regard for free speech and seems determined to fetter our free speech even more. One of the recommendations of this shadowy agency within the Home Office was that classify anyone who referred to two-tier policing as an extremist, anyone who drew attention to the problem of rape gangs across towns and cities, particularly in England. They wanted to classify them as extremists. And this has been rolled out across kind of anti-racism, diversity training courses across the West, but including British police forces.
This kind of brings us to the August riots. So what exactly happened? Why did these people plead guilty?
There are people in prison for social media posts.
Threatening, abusive.
She put it on TikTok. She's got 9 months.
I think in most cases they pled guilty because
Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, is going to bring in the Islamophobia definition into law.
The definition itself was quite controversial. It effectively said any criticism of Islam is suspect and should be banned. What's particularly worrying about it is that
before you hear from Lord Toby Young, I ask if you want to support the Winston Show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Lord Young exploring the issues that you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Lord Young. Lord Young, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I know our American cousins are looking over the pond and thinking, what the hell is going on in Britain? I even think most British people are saying, what the hell is going on when it comes to freedom of speech? And there's much new to talk about. Every week there seems like there's new things to talk about. In January, there was a leak about non-crime hate incidents from the Home Office, which I want to get into. I want to look at the law more generally, but I think we have to start with this new Islamophobia APPG, or rather Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, is going to bring in the Islamophobia, or so it's reported, definition into law. So perhaps you can unpack, we can start with this Islamophobia law and you can unpack it for us.
Yes. So there is an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims in the House of Commons. APPGs don't have a great deal of power. I know this because I've just been made the vice chair of the APPG on free speech. But this particular APG has certainly made an impact because in 2018 it published a report, and in that report it defined Islamophobia. The definition itself was quite controversial. It effectively conflated criticism of Islam, including legitimate, perfectly understandable criticisms of Islam, with racism, and effectively said any criticism of Islam is suspect and should be banned. And it came up with numerous examples of what it had in mind by Islamophobia, which met this very broad definition. And some of the examples are hair-raising. So, for instance, pointing out that Muslims are overrepresented in rape gangs. That's an example of Islamophobia that this group thinks should be prohibited. Pointing out that Islam has in the past been imposed by force on conquered populations. That's Islamophobic. So anyone writing an accurate history of Islam would be guilty of Islamophobia, according to this definition. There are numerous examples like that. I think initially this report was greeted with some skepticism. Why should we try and prohibit people saying truthful things about Islam just because some Muslims may find those things upsetting or offensive? We have free speech in this country. We wouldn't say the same. We wouldn't want to try and protect Christians or Hindus or Buddhists in the same way. Why should Muslims enjoy this special status? But actually, it was taken surprisingly seriously. So the Labour Party officially endorsed this definition. In 2019, I think, various Labour-run councils have embraced this definition and incorporated it into their codes of conduct. And we know, because we've defended some of them, some councillors, Conservative councillors, have been investigated by councils for breaching this definition, falling foul of this definition, this incredibly capacious definition of Islamophobia. So where are we now? The Labour Party, the Labour government, is under a lot of pressure to try and do something to supposedly combat Islamophobia, because a lot of Labour voters deserted the party for independent Muslim candidates at the last election, and the Labour Party is very worried that it's going to lose even more support unless it's seen to be doing something for Britain's Muslim population. So what they're doing is Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, has been tasked with setting up a 16-person advisory council, which is going to come up with a formal legal definition of Islamophobia, which the government is then going to adopt. And I think then recycle in the form of guidance, which it passes on to the police and the Crown Prosecution Service about who to prosecute. We know, or at least we have reasons to suspect, that this 16-person advisory council is going to rubber stamp the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia, because the person tapped up to chair this council is the former Tory Attorney General Dominic Grieve, who wrote a glowing foreword to the APPG's report in 2018, in which he said he heartily welcomed this report and endorsed this report's definition of Islamophobia, including all the examples. So it looks like, we don't know for sure, and it may be that the advisory committee stopped short of suggesting that, you know, the Labour Party tell the police and the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute anyone who is guilty of Islamophobia, according to this long list of examples of what Islamophobia is in the report. But that could easily happen. I think the Labour Party is very keen, the Labour government, to be seen to be doing something for Britain's Muslim population, and this is the obvious thing to do. What's particularly worrying about it is that it's not going to be done in the open. It's not going to be done in Parliament. The government is not proposing to introduce a new bill criminalising Islamophobia. Rather, it's going to argue that Islamophobia is already against the law. And they can say that with some justification. So last weekend, a man in Manchester was arrested and prosecuted for setting fire to a copy of the Koran. And he's been charged with intentionally causing harassment, alarm, or distress. And there's a quote-unquote, a victim, a Muslim passerby who claims to have been extremely distressed by witnessing this Koran burning. And this man is being prosecuted. He's been charged.
And pled guilty.
Well, he initially pled guilty, yes. It may be that he can vacate that plea and put in a not guilty plea. That remains to be seen. The Free Speech Union does have another case of an asylum seeker who's being investigated by the police and is currently out on bail whilst the investigation unfolds, for burning a copy of the Quran and recording it and including that recording on X. And he hasn't yet been charged.
Oh, when was that?
That was a few months ago.
Okay, so that's a migrant that's ongoing.
Yeah, he's an asylum seeker. He's an apostate, former Muslim. And to convey his contempt for the religion he's just left, he burnt a copy of the Quran and included that recording on. He recorded it and included it on X, and we're defending him, and we stand ready to defend him in court should he be charged. He hasn't been charged yet.
If you watch this show, you very likely will have seen Matt Walsh's Daily Wire Plus film, Am I Racist? And if you haven't, I guarantee you'll love it. The sizzling new documentary has been provoking all the right people. The film isn't just funny, it's a flawless expose of woke ideology, and more specifically, the race grievance industry. Here's a clip of my favourite moment.
I used to be a white woman, an unsuccessful one, for many decades, and it was a miserable experience. And really, the hatred of yourselves and each other is like the not seeing your power, the being afraid. Like, all you do is talk shit about each other, talk shit about yourself. Oh my God, I'm so fat.
That's all they do. I'm telling you, these white women.
But that's it. It's, I'm so fat, I'm so stupid, I'm blah, blah, blah.
Sorry.
And now, Matt and the Daily Wire Plus have just released The Making of Am I Racist, which is a behind-the-scenes look at how they pulled it all off. Watch Matt go undercover in a disguise that inspired me to stop wearing glasses. This documentary is a spectacle. Matt's acting skills are even better than his banjo playing, despite my best efforts teaching him. Well, it's his passion.
Okay.
Good. It is a must-watch, and you can now stream Am I Racist and the behind-the-scenes special over on Daily Wire Plus. And if you don't have a Daily Wire subscription, you can use my code Winston30, that is Winston30, and click the link in my description to get 30% off. Now, back to the interview.
But the point is that if someone can be charged with intentionally causing harassment, alarm, or distress, which incidentally carries, typically it would be punished by a custodial sentence. So you go to prison for at least 6 months if you're found guilty of that. If someone can already be charged with that for causing a Muslim extreme distress, the government will say, well, so Islamophobia is already against the law. We just need to define it a bit more clearly. So they want people to be prosecuted for Islamophobia under what is Section 5 of the Public Order Act, 2006, which this chap in Manchester is being charged.
Which is racially and religiously aggravated.
Well, the offence is. I think the offence is twofold. You can either be charged with causing harassment, alarm, and distress. A more serious offence is intentionally causing harassment, alarm, or distress. And this man in Manchester has been charged with the most serious of all, which is religious and racially aggravated, intentionally causing harassment, alarm, or distress. So you can give someone a longer sentence if you can prove that their crime was religiously or racially aggravated. So the government wants to. I think the kind of the argument will be causing Muslims distress is already unlawful under Section 5 of the Public Order Act. We just need to advise the police and the Crown Prosecution Service what counts as causing Muslims distress, what counts as a criminal offence. And there is a reasonableness defence. So if you are prosecuted for causing harassment, alarm, or distress, you can claim it was unreasonable for the person in question to feel that way, or you can claim that what you did is protected under Article 10 in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to freedom of expression. So there are various defences you can mount. So if someone is charged with this and they plead not guilty, the Free Speech Union can swoop in and defend them. And I think the way to fight this, since it won't be possible to fight it in Parliament, will be to fight it in the courts. We'll be able to get courts or juries to find people not guilty if they're charged with causing harassment, alarm, or distress because something they've said or done has caused a Muslim particular distress. In that way, that's the way to fight this creep of the criminalisation of Islamophobia. It can't be done in Parliament because this government is not proposing to change the law, just to define what is a prosecutable offence more carefully and seemingly along similar lines to the definition of Islamophobia in the 2018 APPG report.
So just on this specific Manchester story, I think there's some important context, if it's not just Britain, but for Europe. Last week, Salwan Momika was killed in Sweden. Now, we don't know exactly what the circumstances of his murder were, but we do know that he was a famous Muslim. I believe he was an Iraqi Christian or a Kurd Christian whose family were murdered by ISIS, and he was famous in Sweden for burning the Koran publicly. In Britain, there's of course the Batley Grammar School teacher who 4 years on now we are from the incident in Batley Grammar School where he showed a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. He's still in hiding, and only in November gone 3 months ago, Labour MP Tahir Ali was arguing for blasphemy laws in Britain. So I think that's important to paint the picture of what's going on in Britain around Islamophobia and Europe more broadly. So there's some sort of cultural clash, and you've kind of suggested a little bit of what the Labour's motivations are for this Islamophobia, pushing this sort of definition of Islamophobia. What I don't quite understand is those, aside from the desire to placate or gain Muslim votes, is so obvious that there's a conflation of race and religion, that, Islam is obviously not a race. How is it that anyone would defend that. And there are Muslims who are talking out against this. Famous examples would be the Quilliam Foundation alumni, those guys who, and I believe Haris Rafiq has spoken out against it. They will be deemed Islamophobic under this law. So it's not like all Muslims agreed that it's a good idea. What I can't understand is, why isn't that obvious to everyone that it's a bad idea to conflate Islam and with a race?
I think, I think people are very worried if they challenge attempts to codify Islamophobia and criminalize it, that they'll themselves be accused of being Islamophobes. And once people have conflated criticizing Islam or Muslim activists who want to criminalize Islamophobia with racism, then even if they dispute that conflation, being accused of being an Islamophobe is adjacent to being accused of being a racist, and that is a career killer.
Okay. There's another thing you've brought up is Article 10. Now, I don't want to get too sort of heady and too quickly in this because there's much to discuss, but you cite Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights as a defence of free speech, how it might be used to defend free speech in Britain. I'm not that convinced by it, not least because the article has two parts, and the first part sort of a loose, woolly explanation or a defence of free speech. The second part is, except for in all of these circumstances, including national safety. I think democratic, I've actually got it here, the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of national security, territorial integrity or public safety. And it goes on. So it doesn't seem to me that Article 10 really does defend free speech.
Well, it's certainly less robust than the First Amendment. It is not Europe's version of the First Amendment. And as you say, there are lots of caveats. It's a qualified right. But having said that, all of these free speech rights, both in America and in Europe, are critically dependent on being interpreted in a particular way by Supreme Court justices. In America, and I guess the justices in the European Court of Human Rights here. So in America, for instance, even though the First Amendment was made to the Constitution in the 18th century, it wasn't used in the way it's presently used to defend free speech until the beginning of the 20th century. It depended upon a court, Supreme Court justices, interpreting it in a particular way. Before that, it didn't do a great deal to protect free speech in America. Yes, you're right. The Article 10 doesn't always protect free speech. And the court, I think, has been drifting in the wrong direction and prioritizing Article 8, which is the right to privacy, and other rights above the right to free speech. I think whether or not, a defense of someone burning a copy of the Koran on Article 10 grounds in a British court succeeded would be critically dependent on which judge you got. I know from being involved in some of these high-profile cases that it's always a bit of a crapshoot because you never know what judge you're going to get. In this case, it would be a jury trial. I mean, judges, can influence juries. They can direct them. They frame, what it is the juries have to decide. But I think with a fair-minded judge and the right jury, you could get a verdict of not guilty.
You're referring to the Manchester Koran-burning, or are you talking about if Islamophobia, APPG?
No, I'm talking about if someone was prosecuted for burning a copy of the Quran. I mean, that would be the kind of highest bar, I think. So if you could defend someone's right to convey their disapproval of Islam by burning a copy of the Quran, if they were tried and found not guilty by a jury, then I think it would be very difficult for the government to proceed in the way it wants to, and try and criminalise other lesser forms of so-called Islamophobia. So if it could win that case, I think that would hold the government strategy below the waterline. So we have to persuade someone who is accused of that to plead not guilty, so we can mount the best possible defence. And if we win, I think that would be a really effective way of stopping the government trying to criminalise other lesser forms of Islamophobia. If you can say, that someone who is deeply religious and finds someone trampling on things they believe are sacred, finds it deeply offensive and upsetting, finds that it traumatizes them at their core. If a court decides, no, those may be your religious beliefs, and this may be the most egregious form of blasphemy according to your code, but nevertheless, what this person has done is protected by the right to freedom of expression, then that's going to make it very hard, I think, to prosecute anyone else for other forms of so-called Islamophobia. So that's what I think. That's the battle. We have to find someone willing to plead not guilty, who's burnt a copy of the Quran, and mount a successful defence. If we can do that, then I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to criminalise Islamophobia as defined by the APPG.
Did you say you were going to defend this Manchester? Have you had any contact?
We will if he vacates his plea and pleads not guilty.
I also note that he has been named, as has the person making the accusation against him. But I've been quite shocked that he's even been named, given what happened to Salwan Momika in Sweden. I'm not going to name him on this show because I think he's in serious danger of being seriously harmed.
Yeah, no, the Free Speech Union wrote to Greater Manchester Police a couple of days ago, shortly after they not only named him, but also gave his date of birth and more or less his address, said the area of Manchester in which
full
he lived.
doxing.
I mean, it was essentially the police doxing someone who's just burnt a copy of the Quran. Incredibly irresponsible, given that, as you say, the man who did that in Sweden had been murdered, a few days before. Anyway, we've written to them and said we think this is incredibly irresponsible, and they've agreed to take various steps now to protect him, and we hope they do that. And the Free Speech Union, in the meantime, has found somewhere safe for him to live, so we're doing whatever we can to protect him. But it was, an extraordinary lapse of common sense for the police to name him. Just ridiculous.
Yeah. Is there any examples of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights being used in Britain to protect someone's free speech?
Yeah, there are examples. Harry Miller, ex-Humberside police officer, he had a non-crime hate incident recorded against his name after he published a sort of satirical verse. It wasn't actually a limerick, it's often described as a limerick, about trans people. So a police officer visited him at his place of work and told him, according to Harry, that he'd have to check his thinking. And his tweet was recorded as a non-crime hate incident, which we can go into in more depth.
We definitely have to.
We have to. Concept, which is running riot in Britain at the moment, he challenged both the fact that Humberside Police had recorded this non-crime hate incident against his name, and he challenged the advice, the guidance that Humberside Police were following, which was drawn up by the College of Policing, which is a sort of overarching police body, a quango. The High Court found that Humberside had acted unlawfully, but the College of Policing's guidance wasn't unlawful. So he then challenged the High Court's finding in the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal eventually ruled that actually the guidance devised by the College of Policing, and which Humberside Police and other police forces have been following, was an unlawful interference in Harry's right to freedom of expression under Article 10. So he won that case on Article 10 grounds. And that in due course led to the Conservative government, Suella Braverman, when she was the Home Secretary, laying a statutory instrument which put the recording and retention of non-crime hate incidents on a statutory footing in an attempt to rein in the police and make sure that they weren't going to produce advice or follow advice which was unlawful. But alarmingly, Yvette Cooper, the current Home Secretary, has said she wants to repeal. I think she's more or less said that she wants to repeal that statutory instrument and give the police greater latitude about when to record non-crime hate incidents, which will inevitably lead to much more recording of NCHIs.
So I do want to get into non-crime hate incidents, but I just got one last question about the Islamophobia thing, which is that in this council that Angela Rayner has put together, it includes an imam who was wanted to ban the 2022 film. It was
Lady of Heaven.
Lady of Heaven, exactly. So she's been surrounding herself with those who will support the Islamophobia bill, which is quite concerning.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I think there are reasonable grounds to suspect that what this 16-person advisory council will do will be to rubber stamp the APPG's incredibly broad definition of Islamophobia. And once it's been rubber stamped by this committee, particularly if it's led by a former Conservative Attorney General, so Angela Rayner will be able to say, cross-party committee. It's reached a consensus. This is a broad cross-party definition of Islamophobia. So there'll be nothing controversial about advising the courts to prosecute people for falling foul of this definition.
Yeah. So on non-crime hate incidents, which itself merits a sort of six-part episode series because there's so many unbelievably ludicrous incidents. In January this year, there was a leak of a Home Office review of the non-crime hate incidents, which seemed to support, bringing it back. Is that what you're referring to with Yvette Cooper, or was that something else?
No, that's right. So just to put this in context, in 2014, the College of Policing, this newly created police quango, created by the coalition government, produced some guidance in which it told the police that if a hate crime is reported and investigated and the police conclude that no crime has been committed, they should record it in every case as a non-crime hate incident. And they record it in such a way that if you apply for particular jobs which requires you to do an enhanced criminal records check, it shows up and could prevent you from getting a particular job. So if you want to work with school children, for instance, or for a charity working with vulnerable people like the Samaritans, in all likelihood, if a non-crime hate incident has been recorded against your name, you won't get that job.
And you can't get rid of it easily, right?
It's not easy to get rid of. So one thing we discovered when 4 14-year-old schoolboys had NCHIs recorded against their names after one of them lost a bet, and the forfeit was bring a copy of the Koran into school. He brought a copy of the Koran into school. Someone knocked it out of his hand. It got a little bit scuffed. Suddenly, a mob kind of appeared as if from nowhere outside the school gates. It was a kind of huge issue in the local community. This was in Kettlethorpe, with quite a high Muslim population. And his mother was forced to undergo what seemed a sort of show trial in which she appeared head bowed in front of an audience of angry Muslim men surrounded by police officers and I think the local Labour MP. And she apologised and basically pleaded for her son's life because he'd received death threats as a result of dropping this copy of the Quran in the school playground. And the police, seemingly to placate this mob, said that they'd recorded this episode as a non-crime hate incident. And one thing we discovered when trying to get all 4 of these NCHIs removed is that unlike when someone is prosecuted when a child is prosecuted for a crime, non-crime hate incidents don't expire. They're not spent when the child reaches the age of majority. Most crimes, even quite serious crimes that children are found guilty of, don't follow them around after the age of 18. It gets extinguished from their record at the age of 18. Not non-crime hate incidents. They follow you around like a bad smell. Anyway, we did manage to get these 4 NCHIs removed, and we've had some success at the Free Speech Union in getting
because they were minors.
That may have been one reason the police removed them. And the new guidance, the statutory guidance introduced by Suella Braverman in 2023, did stipulate that the police should not record NCHIs against school children if the incident in question has happened in a school. But we think the police are still doing that.
Well, by the way, there's more ludicrous examples than that, because someone got a school child got one for saying another school girl smelt like fish. I remember that from last year.
Yeah. One man got one for whistling the tune to Postman Pat. That offended
his
Welsh
neighbour
postman, I think.
Oh, right.
But so since the College of Policing introduced this concept, we think about 250,000 NCHIs have been recorded against people in England and Wales alone. That's an average of about 65 a day. You wonder why, if you're burgled or your car's broken into, the police won't even bother to show up at your home. It's because they're far too busy policing our tweets to police our streets. I mean, it's an extraordinary wrong turning that's been taken by the police, who've been persuaded by the College of Policing that it's their job to, in the interests of preserving good community relations, to nip these potential hate crimes in the bud by firing this warning shot across people's bows if they do something that isn't actually a criminal offence but has the kind of whiff of something hateful. I mean, it all dates back seemingly to this American social psychologist called Gordon Allport, who wrote a book in the 1950s based on interviews with victims of the Holocaust, a lot of German Jews who'd survived the Holocaust but who'd been imprisoned or whose relatives had died in the camps. In his book, he says that there are kind of gateways that allowing kind of people to be othered, even making offensive jokes about minorities, beleaguered minorities, was a gateway to genocide. He didn't say it always led to genocide. He just said this is how it starts, and that was crudely became something called the pyramid of hate, with kind of hurty words at the bottom and genocide at the pinnacle. And this has been rolled out across kind of anti-racism, diversity training courses across the West, but including across British police forces. So they now think that if they knock on someone's door and haul them into a police station for committing a hate incident, and give them a talking to and explain that this will be recorded on what will effectively be their criminal records and may prevent them from getting certain jobs, that will nip this hate criminals' activities in the bud, almost like the pre-crime squad in Minority Report, that the police's job isn't to investigate crimes, but to nip potential crimes in the bud. And this seems to be the rationale for recording, 250,000 NCHIs over the last, 11 years. This government is so tone deaf, in spite of the fact that people are crying out for the police to actually investigate real crimes. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, wants the police to record even more NCHIs and wants to do away with this rather limited attempt by the last government to try and rein in the police.
There's been a bit of back and forth for the new government, because there at some point either Starmer or Cooper said, actually, these NCHIs are a problem, we need to do something about it. But that seems to have been reversed in this latest leak from January. So I can't quite work out exactly what their position is.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be the first time Keir Starmer's spoken out of both sides of his face. I think a report commissioned by Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, into how to do more about what she believes were the causes of the disorder in August following the murder of 3 schoolgirls in Southport. I think the government believes that that disorder was not due to public anger about increasingly high levels of mass immigration, about the government's inability to do anything, about illegal immigration, about the placing of asylum hotels in residential areas across the country. Now, it was nothing to do with that. It was because they'd been riled up by bad actors on social media, enabled by Elon Musk.
Yeah.
That was their analysis. That was their diagnosis of the causes of that disorder. And so I think Yvette Cooper thought, well, I'm going to ask this special unit, within the Home Office to investigate what we can do to suppress this misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, which leads to outbreaks of violent disorder. And one of the suggestions, I mean, this group came up with various recommendations, which were frankly terrifying. So it wanted to classify anyone who referred to two-tier policing as an extremist, anyone who drew attention to the problem of rape gangs across towns and cities, particularly in England, but not exclusively in England. It wanted to classify them as extremists. And that in turn would justify, I think, Ofcom forcing social media companies to remove this extremist content from social media platforms on pain of being fined, 5% of their annual global turnover, which is what Ofcom now has the power to do, or will shortly have the power to do under the Online Safety Act. So it seemed to be part of a strategy to suppress what the government thinks of as dangerous content on social media, even if the content isn't itself unlawful. And one of the components of one of the recommendations of this shadowy agency within the Home Office was that more NCHIs should be recorded. That this is the way to tackle this kind of public disorder, to have the police fire more shots across people's bows for committing non-crimes.
Yeah. Look, so this kind of brings us to the August riots and those arrested and convicted after the August riots. And I'd also like to come back to Ofcom and the Online Safety Act. You've just had a recent victory, am I right to understand, in that there was someone who was... well, tell me this story. I've lost it in my notes, but there's some Marine who...
Yeah, so former Royal Marine, a guy called Jamie Michael, in mid-August, early August, posted a video on Facebook prompted by his outrage and horror by the murder of 3 schoolgirls in Southport, and urging his followers to make their feelings about it known by contacting their local MPs, their local councillors, demanding more protection for children, objecting to the placing of asylum hotels in their local towns and so forth. But he made a point of saying, do it peacefully. He clarified, I'm not urging you to do anything unlawful. I'm not encouraging you to be violent or engage in violent protest. Do it peacefully. Make your feelings known, but do it in a peaceful, orderly way. He sometimes used quite clumsy language, but it was clear that he was concerned about episodes like the horrific episode in Southport happening again, wanted the police and the authorities to do more to protect children, and was making his feelings about that clear, but also making it clear he wasn't encouraging anyone to break the law. So this video was watched by a member of the Welsh Parliament, a Labour member of the Welsh Parliament, and one of her staffers, also a Labour councillor, complained to the police and urged the police to investigate this former Royal Marine. The police at that point should have given very short shrift to these Labour politicians, who were clearly, it seems to me, urging that this man be investigated because he'd said something, he'd expressed a political point of view that they disagreed with. But instead of, posting a Facebook video of their own or inviting him to debate, they instead effectively urged the police to investigate him. And the police duly investigated him, referred his video to the Crown Prosecution Service. It was then taken on by a counter-extremism unit within the CPS, and he was duly prosecuted. He luckily pled not guilty. One of the difficulties with defending people who've been prosecuted for saying supposedly inflammatory things on social media about the Southport attacks and dozens of people have been, is that the vast majority of them pleaded not guilty, pleaded guilty, and many of them have received prison sentences as a consequence, and some of them are still in prison to this day. But Jamie Michael pled not guilty, and so the Free Speech Union were able to organise his defence. We got a really good criminal solicitor, a really good criminal barrister. We urged the CPS to drop the charges. We said what he's done is firmly within lawful freedom of expression. He was being accused of stirring up racial hatred by posting this video, which is a crime under the Public Order Act. We said, no, it doesn't come anywhere near to meeting the threshold for stirring up racial hatred. It is firmly within the limits of protected speech protected by Article 10. They refused to drop the charges. He was duly tried in Merthyr Tydfil earlier this week. The trial was supposed to last 3 days. Within 2 days, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. And it took them all of 17 minutes to reach that verdict.
Wow.
And the implication of that is that had many more people who were accused of these speech crimes in the immediate aftermath of the Southport attack while the disorder was taking place, had they pleaded not guilty, they too would have been acquitted by juries. I think so far 6 people who fall within that category have pleaded not guilty, and I think in 4 out of 6 times they've been acquitted by juries.
Yeah, that seems to be the crucial thing, and the big question is then why did so many of them plead guilty? But before you answer that question, the famous example I'd heard before your recent victory was that of Mark Heath, who was a wheelchair-bound guy who was posting on social media. I'm not sure exactly the details of it, but he pled not guilty. Whilst awaiting trial in prison, he was beaten up by an Asian gang. It's an important part of that story, but he was not convicted in the end. And that was when I woke up to the question is, why did everyone plead guilty? And by the way, for listeners, there are some people, and maybe we can explore where the line is, where some people should be in prison for what they said, and where some people didn't. The examples for me that seem ludicrous is 24-year-old Cameron Bell, you might remember, who in the aftermath of the riots live streamed other people, I think, saying racist things, not herself, on TikTok. And I think she got 9 months, and she may only have served 2 or 3, but that seemed ludicrous to me. There's a guy called Lee Dunn who reposted memes, 3 memes. I think perhaps the most quote unquote offensive one was a sort of AI image of a young white girl being stood over by some imams in Westminster, saying something like "coming to a place near you," something like that. And he got 8 weeks, I think, for reposting memes. So for me, that seems egregious. That doesn't seem like he's inciting violence. So what exactly happened? Why did these people plead guilty?
Well, I think in most cases, they pled guilty because they were being held on remand. That is to say, they were going to be in prison until their trials took place if they pled not guilty. And they thought that they were advised by duty solicitors, who are court-appointed solicitors, that if they pled guilty, they'd get a reduction in their sentence, and they'd be sentenced more quickly, and the time they'd spent on remand would be taken into account, so they wouldn't have to spend very long in prison if they received a prison sentence. And I think a lot of them were frightened. They just wanted to get out of prison as soon as they possibly could. One guy actually told us it was a tragic case, that he'd pleaded guilty because he wanted to be out by Christmas so he could be back with his family for Christmas. This is when he was arrested in August. And in fact, he wasn't out by Christmas. I think he received something like 2 years and is still serving time. So I think a lot of them were poorly advised. They were put under a lot of pressure. I think the Prime Minister and the Director of Public Prosecutions were putting political pressure on the police to try and secure as many guilty verdicts as they could, so they could nip the disorder in the bud. They wanted to see people going to prison as soon as possible to try and deter any further outbreaks of disorder. I mean, I think it's deeply politically suspect, and I think there are lots of miscarriages of justice. We've got a few other cases at the Free Speech Union in which we're appealing the length of the sentences people were given, and we hope that in some cases we might be successful. So when people received long prison sentences for participating in public disorder in 2011, many of those sentences were reduced on appeal. So we're optimistic that we can get some of those sentences reduced, but it's quite hard to get verdicts overturned if people pleaded guilty.
Do you think any of them have been convicted legitimately? Do you think it's that there were people who did cross the line, who even though you might say they had free speech, they actually went too far and they did incite violence?
Well, I wouldn't defend people who've said something that really has incited violence. But I think in almost every case, it's really difficult to show every case of people who've been convicted of inciting violence in connection with the disorder following the Southport attacks. In almost every case, when you look at the rationale that the judge has come up with during sentencing for sending them to prison, they try and demonstrate that what this person said caused violence. And in almost every case, it's incredibly flimsy and threadbare, trying to show a kind of chain of causal links between disorder and what the person said is incredibly difficult. And most of the social science literature suggests that the causes of public disorder are incredibly complicated, and it's incredibly simple-minded to attribute what one person said, however inflammatory, as the sort of primary cause of an outbreak of social disorder. I mean, you mentioned Cameron Bell. I mean, how could her live stream of a riot as it was unfolding on TikTok.
Aftermath of the riot. Wasn't even the riot.
It was an aftermath of the riot. How could that have possibly caused the riot? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And I think in almost every case, possibly every case of those convicted simply for saying something on social media, since August, I think in almost every case they wouldn't have been convicted if the First Amendment had existed in this country. The First Amendment would have protected them. Now, it may be that they broke the law as it stands, because under the law, under the stirring up clauses in the Public Order Act, even if you've said something that hasn't actually led to any disorder, any violence, you can still be prosecuted for intending to stir up racial or religious hatred or hatred against someone on the basis of their sexual orientation. Intent is enough to prosecute, to find them guilty, even if what they've said hasn't in fact led to a criminal offence being committed, any disorder breaking out. That was part of the 1966 Race Relations Act, which eventually found its way into the Public Order Act. I mean, that would have been struck down by the Supreme Court for being a breach of the First Amendment in the United States. And certainly the Free Speech Union would like to see that law changed. So what I'd like to see is a return to the English common law breach of the peace principle. That principle held that within certain limits, so it doesn't permit people to commit treason or to traffic in child pornography or to libel somebody, but within those strict limits, you're permitted to say anything, provided it doesn't lead to a breach of the peace. That's that principle, the English common law breach of the peace principle. That really is the First Amendment. That's what the desire to incorporate the English common law breach of the peace principle in American law was what prompted the First Amendment of the Constitution to be made. That's what we need to return to.
What year was the breach of the peace?
Well, it's been a fundamental principle of English common law for hundreds of years.
Since the Bill of Rights sort of period, or
since the Bill of Rights, yeah.
It
still survives in some parts of English common law, but when you change the law to say that merely intending to stir up racial hatred or religious hatred is a criminal offence, then you are departing from that English common law breach of the peace principle. It should be a defence, as it is in America, to say what they said didn't lead to an outbreak of disorder and wasn't likely to lead to an outbreak of disorder. And that principle has found its way into what's called the Brandenburg test, the famous Supreme Court case in which it was determined that unless what somebody has said is going to lead to imminent lawless action, that's American for breach of the peace, then it should be permitted. I mean, one of the difficulties with all of these grey areas, these attempts to police and suppress speech, which isn't actually unlawful, like recording things as non-crime hate incidents, like, Ofcom forcing social media companies to remove content that may not be against the law, but which may supposedly stir up disorder, is that you introduce a grey area. One of the sacrosanct principles of English common law, one of the things which distinguishes it from, the Napoleonic Code, is that unless something is explicitly prohibited by law, then it's permitted. That's one of the linchpins of English liberty. And when you say that things shouldn't be permitted, even though they're not explicitly prohibited by law, then you are departing from that essential pillar of English liberty. So what we need to do, I think, to defend free speech in this country is go back to the English common law breach of the peace principle. All these weeds have grown up in the rose garden that is English common law, all these weeds fettering what people can say. We need to strip them out and restore that rose garden to its original beautiful state.
This was actually the last question I had for you, is what to do about it. But I think there's a lot of weeds we haven't talked about in this. And it might be worth, even if we don't go deep into all of them, just looking at some of them. We've talked a lot about the Public Order Act of 1986, there's a Communications Act of 2003, a Malicious Communications Act 1988, the Terrorism Act, of course, which prohibits supporting prescribed groups like Hamas, Defamation Act 2013, there's the Equality Act of 2010, Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, that's probably part of the Public Order Act of 1986, that's 1994. But basically, if you look into it, and you think about Article 10, we've already talked about Part 2 of Article 10, it just seems that free speech in Britain is a myth. Now, I'd go a little bit further and be like, the more I look into it, when did we really ever have free speech? It seems to me that we have a reputation because in the English and Scottish Enlightenment, we have these famous tracts like John Milton's Areopagitica, like John Stuart Mill on liberty, and these famous passages about defending free speech. But did those come about because we didn't actually have free speech? Is free speech, did we ever really have it, or is it kind of a myth in this country?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. I think the right to free speech really originated in England. With the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. And for centuries, free speech has been defended here, which is why so many political emigres would seek sanctuary in Britain. I think that remained true right up until the 1960s. And then we started to introduce these various laws which fetter what we can say. It's partly linked to immigration and Britain becoming a multicultural, multi-faith society. But if we look at, why is the government trying to protect Muslims by criminalizing Islamophobia? Well, it's prioritizing community relations over the right to free speech. It's, and I think that's happened over the past, 60 years or so, 65 years. Successive governments have decided that protecting the feelings of these different identity groups is more important than standing up for free speech. People have lost sight of why free speech is important. I think we took it for granted for centuries. And because we've taken it for granted, we're not familiar with the case for it. And so that case has to be made anew. I think part of the difficulty is that the natural human impulse, when someone says something that you find deeply offensive, when someone tramples on values you consider sacred, is to shut that person up, if possible, to excommunicate them. We see that in human societies dating back to the beginning of time, tolerating people who say things that we find deeply upsetting and offensive, which shake us to our very core, which seem to threaten the fabric of our society. That's comparatively new. That dates back a few hundred years. And in most countries, for not nearly as long as that. And it needs to be constantly nurtured and argued for. We need the institutions which supposedly are bulwarks of liberty, which stand up for free speech, to constantly be making the case to defend the principle. And over the past 60 years or so, and I think it's accelerated in the past 15, all these institutions which are supposed to be bastions of free speech, whether media companies, universities, the civil service, parliament, they've all began to resile from that principle. And so we're seeing the collapse of free speech in Britain. And I think that's terrible for various reasons, but it's not just terrible for us. It's terrible for all those other countries around the world which look to us and have looked to us for a lead on this issue. But I would say to your people in America or elsewhere in the world watching this, that, the fight is not lost. There are still some people in this country who believe in free speech, who recognize its fundamental importance to the health and vitality of liberal democracy, and who are doing their utmost to defend it. There is an emerging coalition of people across various institutions and industries who are determined to fight back, to defend free speech. And sometimes we win. We won in the Jamie Michael case. And why did we win? Because there is amongst ordinary British people still, I think, a deep regard for the importance of free speech. That's why that jury took 17 minutes to acquit him. That's who we can rely on, I think. That's who we can enlist in defence of this essential democratic right.
So that's where the defence comes from, but the offence, I kind of, as you're speaking now, I'm thinking of Milei in Argentina and his famous video of him going afuera and taking apart all these things. I've listed all these different acts. Do we need a political fight back where someone actually gets rid of a lot of this crap, this non-crime hate incidents being the most obvious one? How does that happen?
Well, I think there are multiple kind of battle fronts. One of them is the law. Another is, the public square. Another is the media. But certainly in politics, we need a government that's going to strip away all these fetters on our free speech and restore the English common law breach of the peace principle. And I don't think it's out of the question that could happen. I mean, I think if the right can get its act together, this current Labour government, which is easily the most authoritarian government since the Second World War and probably before that, which seems to have so little regard for free speech and seems determined to fetter our free speech even more, I think it'll only be a one-term government if the right can get its act together. And I think because this government has such profound contempt for free speech, that is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So whoever succeeds this government, I think, will focus on how to not just restore those rights that this government has removed, but to more profoundly defend the right to free speech.
I mean, it's not exactly like the preceding Conservative governments. Most of this was turbocharged under their watch. It's not exactly like we can say this is a problem of the left. It seems to be very much have been a problem of the British right.
That's true, but I think the right has finally woken up to the fact that all of these laws that in many cases Conservative governments put on the statute book, which fetter our free speech, have been weaponized by the radical progressive left to silence conservatives.
Right.
So I think they've woken up to the fact that it's not in their interests to allow these laws to remain on the statute books. And I hope that the leaders of both Reform and the Conservative Party are thinking seriously about what we need to do in this country to restore free speech.
Well, we've got 4.5 years left of Labour, so it seems to me anyway. One thing looming on the horizon, which we've alluded to a couple of times, is the Online Safety Act and Ofcom. This was born out of the terrible, suicide of a young girl called Molly Russell. This happened under the Tories. And this is important now because we're seeing this kind of fight back. People hate Elon Musk. He's the new devil. And what's going on X, where there's more free speech, certainly more free speech than on YouTube, as we found on this channel. But it seems that the ire of the left is directed there, and it seems like the Online Safety Act, Online Safety Bill, will be a vehicle for them to take on X and Twitter. What do we need to keep an eye on? How do you see this unfolding, and what do we need to understand about the Online Safety Act?
Well, we don't quite know how authoritarian Ofcom, which is the regulator that's been tasked with regulating social media. It's our broadcast regulator, but its scope has been extended. We don't know how authoritarian it's going to be when it comes to enforcing the Online Safety Act, because they haven't started enforcing it yet, at least most of it. That's due to happen in March. One of the things that the Free Speech Union and other free speech campaigners managed to get stripped out of the Online Safety Bill was the clause empowering the Secretary of State at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to come up with a list of content that wasn't against the law, but which nevertheless Ofcom should direct social media companies to remove as a matter of priority. And that clause was referred to as the legal but harmful clause, because the content a Secretary of State was going to be empowered to include, would have been stuff that wasn't actually against the law. We managed to get that stripped out. So in theory, anyway, Ofcom should only go after social media companies that don't remove content that's explicitly unlawful. But the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, one of these pro-censorship lobby groups, this one, in fact, set up by Morgan McSweeney, currently Keir Starmer's chief of staff and probably the most powerful man in Downing Street after Keir Starmer. He set up the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. It held a meeting in August whilst the riots were unfolding to see what they could do vis-a-vis the Online Safety Act to make sure that the content they identified as the primary cause of the disorder was removed as a matter of priority. And they effectively suggested that the clause the Free Speech Union and others managed to get stripped out of the Online Safety Bill be brought back via an amendment. So I think one thing to look out for is the government amending the Online Safety Act to give, I think in this case, it'll be Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, who's a very close ally of Morgan McSweeney's. The proposal by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate in August, when they had this emergency summit about how to suppress heretical content on social media, which was supposedly causing the disorder. The proposal is that Peter Kyle be given the power to draw up a list of supposedly dangerous, harmful things that appears on social media and direct Ofcom to insist that those things are removed as a matter of priority. Now, one of the kind of caveats in this proposal is that the Secretary of State, Peter Carl, should only have this power in an emergency. But we know that invoking emergencies is a kind of familiar tactic of the radical progressive left to suspend democratic norms. We're always in an emergency of one kind or another. We're supposedly in the midst of a climate emergency. Does that mean when this new power is granted to Peter Kyle, he'll be able to direct Ofcom to suppress any criticism of Ed Miliband's crazy net zero policy on the grounds that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, and anyone who encourages people to oppose the decarbonisation of our national grid by 2030 is trafficking in harmful information, because it'll delay these essential measures to cope with this climate emergency. Who knows? That's something to look out for. But the Online Safety Act is pretty bad even without this amendment, and I wouldn't be surprised if Ofcom just off their own bat start urging social media companies like X and Facebook to start removing content that isn't unlawful. They'll argue it's a breach of their terms and conditions, and they're only asking them to enforce their terms and conditions. But I think that could easily lead to a showdown with Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. They might say, no, I'm not going to remove this content if it's not unlawful in the United Kingdom. You threatened to fine me, 5, I think it's even 10% of our annual global turnover. We're not going to pay that fine. What we've done, this content isn't unlawful. We shouldn't have removed it. There'll be a massive legal fight about that because the stakes are incredibly high financially. And I think if that happens, Trump could easily weigh in on the side of Musk and Zuckerberg, and that would make things very uncomfortable for the British government. So I'm hoping that if Ofcom does overreach, if it does try and order Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg to remove content that isn't unlawful, they'll say no. There'll be a big bun fight. Trump will weigh in on the side of his tech bros, and the British government will back down. But we'll see.
Do you think there's any need at all for an Online Safety Act? Do you think there's enough law about what is legal that we don't need anything extra? Or is there any point where you think actually it'd be reasonable to have some rules and regulations?
I don't think that. I don't think that we need social media to be regulated by the state. I think the problem is granting the state the power to order social media companies to remove content is inevitably going to be politically abused. We can never trust people in power to make those decisions impartially. And we've seen how, the Biden-Harris administration abused its powers to force social media companies or to browbeat social media companies into removing content that they politically disapproved of. We see it with the censorship industrial complex. We have a kind of smaller kind of road company version of the censorship industrial complex in this country, which is thriving, particularly under this government. Much better, I think, that we should entrust the users of social media to regulate social media themselves. Like the note system that Elon Musk
community
notes, and which Mark Zuckerberg says he's going to replicate on Facebook in preference to farming that out to fact checkers who really can't be trusted. So if people are at risk of being triggered by offensive content, they should be able to adjust their own safety settings. They shouldn't be able to force the government to remove that content because they might be triggered by it. So I think that social media, like the press, is perfectly capable of self-regulation and does not need to be regulated by the state.
Lord Young, I'm conscious that you're a very busy man and need to get back to work. So I hope we can continue the conversation. There's several topic areas that I wasn't able to get into, but I'd love to get to another conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. What can listeners, where should they find you? What's next? What do they need to pay attention to? What can we know about the Daily Skeptic or Free Speech Union that you need support for, maybe the public, those who heard this and want to support you?
Well, I do sort of two jobs, really. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Daily Skeptic, which is dailyskeptic.org, which is a news publishing site in which many of the things we've been talking about are aired, and in which, the writers try and make the case as best they can against over-regulation, against authoritarian intrusion into our liberties. It started out as a kind of hub of lockdown skepticism, but it's kind of branched out now into skepticism about other forms of state overreach, such as net zero, woke gobbledygook in all its manifestations, and so on and so forth. So please come and check out The Daily Skeptic. But in addition, my main job is running the Free Speech Union, which is a non-partisan mass membership organisation that stands up for the speech rights of its members and campaigns for free speech more widely. And you can join the Free Speech Union, and if you join and then you get into trouble like Jamie Michael did, we will, in almost every case, come to your defence. And we've got, teams of lawyers. We're quite well resourced. And, we fought over 3,300 cases in the past 5 years. It was set up in 2020, where those cases have come to a conclusion. We've been successful almost 80% of the time. We now have 25,000 members. Many of our cases, when the Free Speech Union was first established, The Guardian ran a succession of hit pieces about it. Of course they did.
Badge of honour, actually.
Badge of honour. And they said in almost every one that it would just be defending the rights of male, stale and pale old Tories like me. Those were the only people whose free speech was under threat. And it was a good thing that, they weren't been given the platform they once had because they're privileged and toxic and so forth. And I was a standard bearer of this kind of toxic phalanx. And it turns out, Winston, that the largest single category in our case files by far, so 40% of the 3,300 plus cases we fought in the past 5 years have been women who've gotten into trouble for expressing their belief in the biological reality of sex, women who've objected to having to share changing rooms or lavatories with biological men or to compete against biological men in sport. It isn't male, pale and stale men like us,
yes,
whose free speech is under threat. The front line, the coalface, are mostly left-wing feminists.
But The Guardian will argue, of course, that those mostly left-wing feminists are in fact bigots.
That's right. According to
I'm sure they won't be persuaded
by the
by
radical
this.
progressive left.
Yeah.
But believe me, they're not far right. They're left-wing.
Lord Young, thank you so much for your time, and I hope we can do this again.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show. That was Lord Toby Young. If you want to support this show, remember all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Toby Young exploring the issues you want to hear about the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.